Hello, I'm Ron Fox for getwoodworking.com, and I shall be looking at routers and the features that you should be looking for to get the best out of them. Now, when we were looking at various routers just now, I set great store by having a top quality collet on the grounds that this is the link between your motor spindle doing up to 27,000 revs a minute and a formidable lump of tungsten carbide whizzing around on the end of the spindle. So as far as I'm concerned, I want to feel fairly happy that my cutter shank is held very firmly. And so I would always choose a collet that, I would always choose a router in fact, that had a first class properly engineered collet. And I've got some examples here. And I'll take a big one because it's easier to see. Now this is the 1/2 inch collet from those two 1/2 inch routers I was looking at. It's been around for many years and it consists of two parts. The actual collet itself, which you can see is a tempered steel tapered device with slots in it, and the collet nut into which you snap the collet. Now there is a shoulder machined on this collet. You would see from, if you could see in there, a corresponding ring or shoulder that this hooks over. Now provided you haven't got a shank in the collet, the slots in it enable it to compress just sufficiently to snap into that nut. And this is the way it should be used. If you don't snap it into the nut, you will get your cutters in your router after a fashion, but they won't be very safe. But when you go to take them out, what will happen is that you'll simply unwind the nut and it will come off the thread of the motor spindle, leaving the collet jammed firmly in the tapered motor spindle with the cutter shank equally firmly held in it. And you will then start looking for a bit of wood and a hammer or some other primitive method of getting the cutter out. And I've heard some pretty hair-raising stories featuring hammers, bits of wood, mole wrenches and so on about getting stuck cutters out. And 99 times out of 100 it is simply because the collet was not snapped into the nut. So this is the top quality tapered steel collet that slides into the corresponding taper in the motor spindle. As you tighten it, it forces it down into the taper, squeezes the slots in it and grips the cutter shank firmly and evenly. So there we have the top quality type collet. And in the smaller routers that we looked at, we had exactly the same idea, only of course smaller to fit the smaller motor spindle of the smaller router. However, there has been a change in recent years. What is now happening slowly, and so far it's mainly among the smaller routers, is that when the manufacturer makes the collet is embedded into the nut at the manufacturing stage and it doesn't take apart. Now it could be, although I've got no evidence to support this, but it could be that maybe the manufacturers and the service agents have been getting a bit fed up with people bringing in routers and saying they couldn't get their cutters out. But anyway, what happens is that comes like that. This happens to be an 8mm cutter, and there's a smaller one, and these go with the smaller routers. The great thing is that you don't have to snap them in and you can't snap them out, and the other thing is that you get a nut with each collet, so you don't have to buy yourself a separate nut, so that each collet lives in its own nut. Now if you were brought up on the old school of ELU routers years ago, you grew up thinking, well, a collet is a collet, this is what a collet is. And it's not until you look at some of the other routers, not necessarily the cheapest Far Eastern ones, although they're very common there, but even some of the more expensive routers, you find that all collets are not created equal. Now here's an example of a little one that is just a little solid lump of presumably steel. It's got the smallest possible sort of bevel or taper there, and that graunches down into a body on the end of the router motor spindle, and it's very shallow, and it's much more difficult because it's not multi-slotted tempered steel to tighten up. So when you're looking at a router, especially assuming that you're going to give it a fair amount of use, I think first class collet is one of the top requirements of a good router. You want something that's going to hold your cutter firmly so that the collet and the cutter runs true and it doesn't let go suddenly with possibly disastrous results. And it needs to be something that you can tighten up and loosen fairly reasonably with a decent spanner without the effect of some of these basic collets where they jam on when you tighten them up and you skin your knuckles when you are trying to get them off again. So the sign, the usual recognition sign of a top quality collet is that you've got a tapered bright silver device set in a nut. And I said that these days they're coming readily or already embedded in the nut. I think it was Bosch who started this a few years ago with their 900 and 1300 professional range that were made in the States. But it's spreading. You find these for the smaller collets in DeWalt, Trend and all the clones of those now. And again, it's obviously one of the things that is spreading, and it's the shape of things to come. But it is high on my list of a reliable router to have a first class collet.